Okay. All right, good people, are we ready to go? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8 people? 8 whole people? Okay, here we go. So, all right, good morning. Welcome to Tuesday? Is it Tuesday?
Yeah,
Tuesday? Okay. So here we are in History 12. We've got some people online. So Michaela's online. Good morning, Michaela. And Kevin's online so far. So good morning, Kevin, in addition to our live studio audience. If you will remember yesterday, and Ayushi's there too. Good morning, Ayushi. Oh, and someone else is there too. Hang on. Hang on. And Shania's there too. Good morning, Shania. Okay. Yesterday, what did we do yesterday? So, oh yeah, we talked about the British home front, right? Because I wanted to say that it's important to know what's happening during a war, during battles, because that's what people often focus on. But of course, there's millions of people fighting a war, but there's also millions and millions of people at home, right? And life, of course, doesn't stop for them. Life continues on, but it also changes in significant ways, especially in this type of war, because World War I is kind of the first example, maybe not the first example, but the first example we have in sort of the modern period of history where we have a situation of total war, right? And we said yesterday, I think, that total war was a situation where basically an entire country is mobilized toward fighting and winning the war, right? And so it's not a war that's kind of happening off to the side and people don't pay attention to, which more often characterizes wars that we have in the West today. So again, the US went to war in Iraq, but for most Americans, they didn't really pay too much attention to it and their life didn't change. But here in World War I, we see that people's lives do change as a result of the war effort, right? And so, yeah, this is kind of one of the first instances of total war we have in the modern period, but as you might guess, it won't be the last, right? We said that there were a few important sort of social and cultural changes in Britain, but these are probably similar to what happened in other European countries as well. So we have women entering the workforce kind of in full. Good morning. We have women entering the workforce kind of in huge numbers. We have the government more tightly regulating people's working hours and their leisure hours. I didn't get a chance to look up the moving the clock forward or back or whatever it was, and so still don't know how that worked. But either way, the government was focused on making the population more productive, right? Because again, their ability to produce food and essentials, but also weapons for soldiers was going to be essential to winning the war. And so the government sort of stepped forward and took control of that. We said that the economic order of society may have shifted a little bit too, because some people might have been able to earn more money. So if you had a house full of women, maybe you had, good morning, maybe you had 4 daughters or something like that, then suddenly those 4 daughters are going to work and they're earning wages and they're making money for the household. And so maybe your household can afford things that it couldn't afford before. And the textbooks suggest things like pianos and gramophones, which are early record players and things like that. And we see that people also need some sort of release for their tension, right? And so we'll see this again. You'll see this again in many sort of major conflicts where people are tense. The situation is, dire, and people need some sort of release. They need to be able to cut loose. And so theaters become popular, so people kind of escape their existence by going to watch movies, which we still do today, of course. There's dance halls, there's bars that open up, people are dancing, people are drinking. And again, I think the textbook suggested that there was a bit of a relaxing of kind of social rules and social morals, right? And I don't know if the book did a really good job of communicating that, but that kind of happens in wartime too, right? Where you have, all these people are going overseas and they're dying, and people kind of feel their own mortality, right? They feel that, life is short kind of thing. And I think the textbook said life is cheap, but I don't know. I don't like that. I think it's more like, life is short. It's a seize the day, YOLO kind of feeling that people have. And so, social rules kind of get pushed aside. People party a little more. People drink a little more. People sort of break social rules because it's an extreme time, right? And so that has a tendency to kind of make people question the social order, the social norms, and the social rules that they live by. What else did we do? Oh yeah, changes on British society. We said that there was empowerment of women, right? So women go into the workforce, not for the first time, but definitely to a greater degree than they did before. And because they have these jobs that formerly men held and they're kind of making their own money, that gives them autonomy, right? That gives them power, that gives them decision-making ability, which they would have had less of before, right? I think we can all intuitively know if you're not paying your own bills, it's hard to kind of make all of your own choices, right? So women were in the same situation, right? They were provided for by their fathers or husbands, and so when you depend on your father or husband for money, you don't get to make all of your own decisions. But women gained some autonomy, they gained some power during this period. We said that poorer families were able to kind of move their way up the economic ladder. In some cases, standard of living didn't rise significantly because later on there was rationing of food and things like that. But people, in some cases, were able to make more money. So that was helpful to some people as well. And in some countries, Canada notably, I don't know I think Canada and the United States, this happens. I'm not sure about how women gain the right to vote in the UK and other countries. But certainly in Canada, the war effort, World War I, is very tightly connected to women gaining the right to vote. And so prior to World War I, women did not vote. They were in the process of fighting for it, so they were marching and doing demonstrations and sometimes getting arrested and things like that. But it was World War I that finally allowed them to vote. And to make a kind of a long story short, the government that was, good morning, come on in. The government that was trying to get elected felt that they would be able to gain some votes if they gave women the right to vote. And so they promised that if they were elected, they would give women the right to vote. And of course, they secured, they won the election, and that happened. And so it was a bit of a political move by the government that was trying to get in. But either way, some women gained the right to vote starting in this period, in Canada anyway. Oh yeah, so I wanted to explore this, explore women in the war a little bit more. What I'm going to try to do this term that I haven't done a good job of in previous terms is to highlight places where places in kind of the history of the 20th century and Canada and the US in that 20th century, highlight places where certain stories are not being told. And women are one of them, but there's also a number of other diverse communities in terms of race or ethnicity or religion that are not commonly part of that story. And so I'm going to, at a few points in this term, I'm going to try to include them so that we don't sort of miss their story and miss their voices, because of course all of those people are an important part of the history of the 20th century. And of course, women are as well. They make up 50% of our societies, right? So how could they not be important, right? But unfortunately, the way history is often written, women's voices are left out and women's roles are left out. And so I'll try to include those different voices at a few points this term. So what I'm going to do is I have a short video for us to watch. And so if you are online, oh, Ananda's here too. Good morning, Ananda. I'm going to post a link and a couple of questions for you. And the questions I'm posting for you here are the following. The questions I'm posting for you here are the following. So one, what I want you to do when we're watching this video is pay attention to a couple things. Number one is, how are traditional gender roles maintained during the war? And so gender roles are kind of the way that men and women are supposed to behave, quote unquote. So how are men and women supposed to behave? What are they supposed to do? What are they not supposed to do? What are men's jobs and what are women's jobs traditionally? How should men act? How should women act? Those kinds of things, okay? So I want you to pay attention to how traditional gender roles are maintained, how they are sort of kept going. But also I want you to pay attention to how those gender roles shift and change. And so the video will explain a few things to us. And then the last question I have for you is, what are the sort of positive or negative outcomes of these changes? And so if you're in my social justice class or if you've been in it before, you'll know that gender roles are socially constructed, right? We decide as a society what is men's job and what is women's job, and with the exception of childbirth, which is a natural thing, all of those things are just decided by society. And so they change between societies. So different societies have slightly different gender roles, and they change through time as well. People reimagine and redefine what gender roles are. And so, so I'd like you to pay attention to how are gender roles maintained, how do they change, and what are some of the positive or negative outcomes you might imagine coming from those shift in gender roles, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to very quickly just figure out how long this video is.
My boss will thank you. The Lawnmower 3.0. Now.
Yeah. I'm gonna.
Hi, I'm Jesse, and this is Flo.
No, hang on.
My boss will thank you.
No. YouTube ads. Okay. So, how long is this video? Okay. This video is 10 minutes long. So I'll give, for online people, I'm just gonna set a timer and you can watch the video and then come back in about 12 minutes and then we'll talk about the answers, okay? So the link is in Microsoft Teams, and so you can watch it there and answer the questions. So I'm gonna Okay, ready, people?
Can you see the question?
Sure, sure, sure. Maybe another minute. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's try and talk about some of these. I'm just going to take those off the screen so I can see what anyone might say online here. So, as you can see in this video, the presenter, whose name I don't know, the presenter give us a little more in depth about what women's role, at least in Western countries and a little bit in Western Europe too, what their role was during World War I. And we probably learned some things that we heard some things that we already knew, and maybe we learned some new things. But let's talk about the traditional gender roles. How are those kind of things maintained during the war? What kind of examples did we hear of in the video?
They said that the role that the mothers first was still there for women.
Mm-hmm.
So that no matter what they did, they were first mothers. Take care of the household.
Right. So a lot of things changed in terms of how women were seen and what women were able to do, or what women were allowed to do. But that remained constant, right? The idea that women were first and foremost mothers, right? And I think to some degree that's still there's still a thread of that runs through many societies as well, right? That women are supposed to be mothers or seen as mothers first, right? That's good. What else? They were what? What? I just didn't hear what you said.
They were in the war.
They were definitely in the war. So they were included in the war effort, but how do we still see evidence of gender roles even in their inclusion?
They were only giving half the wages the men would receive for the same jobs.
Right.
They thought they can handle, weapons and everything, so they gave only nurses and drivers.
Right. So there's two parts of that. Yeah. One is that they were paid half as much. They were paid less, which is, pretty clear evidence that women's contributions are not as valued as men's contributions, right? And second, we see that they're not given exactly the same jobs that men are. And so we have these traditional gender roles of male and female, and then we have this war happen, but it doesn't mean that those gender roles go away. And so women are included in the war effort, but only in certain ways, right? So we see them, okay, I won't say any more about that. What's that? They were underappreciated, yes, and I wanted to I wanted to point that out too. Before I address that, I just want to say Ananda is online here, and she mentions that even tough women were working in the most dangerous departments, and they still got half the wage that men got. And so that's actually that one, Anand, is a little bit of the answer to both questions, right? The idea that women were, their role changed in that they were seen as a little bit tougher than they used to be, right? They were doing these factory jobs, but still they're paid half as much, right? So their gender still kind of works against them in this situation, right? That's good, Ananda. But Aliana, yeah, I wanted to point out, sorry, what did you say? Yeah, they were underappreciated, which is interesting, right? Because we're almost thinking about them in this classroom as kind of heroes, right? That, men went off to fight the war, but then women stepped up, right? They stepped into the roles of men, they took care of their families, they worked, they did whatever needed to be done in order to help the country win the war. And so we're kind of seeing them more as these kind of, brave, heroic women, which they certainly were. But it's also interesting to think at the time, that they weren't probably as appreciated as, to the degree that we're appreciating them right now, right? Which is important. But I think you're correct there. Shamimu here says women were underseen as compared to men, since men were the ones with the highest jobs. Yeah, that's true too. So even within the military, we see that women were relegated to either, they were still off to the side or they were kind of lower, right? You didn't see female generals or anything like that, right? So even though women were now included, they're not included at higher levels, right? And they're certainly not paid equitably to men either. What else? Other evidence of traditional gender roles? What kind of work did women do?
And factory workers.
Right, so we saw them farming and factory work, and those were instances where certainly women stepped into the shoes of men, right? Men would have been doing the farming and the factory work, and so women had to step in to fill that to fill that void, that absence, right?
Taking some jobs from the men.
Perhaps, yeah.
Small portion.
Yeah, perhaps. What? Did you have something? No? Okay.
Were women allowed to be nurses?
Yeah, so women were nurses, right? But not doctors, right? So there were no female doctors at the time, but nursing was a woman's occupation, right? So there were no, nowadays you have male nurses as well, although they're still in the minority. But yeah, at the time there was a pretty strong gender difference in medicine, right? So men were doctors, women were nurses, and never the other way around, right? So we see women fulfilling that role. What else? What else did they do? They said they were in the signal corps. Do you know what that means? Yeah, so this is an age where people communicate through telegraph. Do you know what telegraph is? Everybody, yeah. So people are communicating through Morse code telegraph, and so that work is given to women. And so women are kind of working in offices, tapping out messages, sending messages and decoding them and things like that. So women are doing kind of office work and message work. They're nurses, but of course, in very, very few cases are they actually fighting, right? And so we heard a few instances where women are actually fighting, but maybe we'll get to that in a second. Well, actually, let's get to it. Let's get to it right now. So and Ayushi says they were doing more manual labor than they were doing before. That's probably more of an answer to how did traditional gender roles change, but yeah, that's what we'll go with. So how do the traditional gender roles change? Certainly women are doing more physical manual work than they were doing before. That is definitely true. What else?
They're more independent than before.
Yeah, they have more independence for sure. Not total independence, but more. What else?
I think we're fighting for fighting for rights to vote.
right? So that's true, and that's a bit of a longer. That's a longer process, but it happens at the same time as the war, and they were fighting for the right to vote, and they succeed in some cases. Although we should probably point out that not all women are given the right to vote, and so it's white women who are given the right to vote first, and then women of color have to wait quite a bit longer, unfortunately. So this is there's a victory for gender equality here, but it's not for racial gender equality.
Racism was also that time.
What's that?
Racism.
Oh yeah. Racism is it's a racist time. So yeah, white women are given the right to vote, but not all women. How else? How else do traditional gender roles change?
They have more rights.
They have more rights. Let's see. That's probably true. Like, how are you thinking about that?
Like the woman now become it's become
I think I know what you're saying. I just want to make sure that what I think I know is what you're saying.
they become like president prime minister and like higher.
It's true. I would say,
They didn't have that right.
I don't think they really gain anything in terms of legal rights, except for the right to vote. But they do gain more freedom, for sure. They are, again, this is a period where, it's kind of a period of cultural upheaval. A lot of the traditional ways of doing things are kind of thrown out the window because it's an emergency situation. And so, yeah, women are able to maybe not have, I might not say rights, but definitely more freedoms, right? So women gain freedom, they gain autonomy, they gain more power to choose things for their own life.
They had the right to work and
The right to what?
the right to work and
Yeah, they do gain those things. I don't know if they're necessarily legal gains, but they're social. They're social and cultural, and that's definitely true. Ananda says here, women started to enlist in the Navy and fight. Yeah, so there's a handful of women who actually manage to fight. Some of them have to lie to do it, which we've heard about. But and then in Russia in 1917, there's actually a battalion that gets government support, right? So that's a big deal too, and that's a big change for.
Russia surrendered around 1917.
What's that?
The Russians.
They get out of the war in 19. Yes, in is it 17? Yeah, it's 1917 when. So.
They put Lenin on the train and sent him back to Russia.
No. That happens. It's Lenin who takes them out of the war.
I know.
Yeah.
The Germans put him on a train and sent him off.
Yeah. Yes, they do. But that's part of another story. But you're right. Yeah. So the Russians have a battalion full of women who are fighting together, and that's revolutionary, right? Shania here says that approximately 2 million women during the war replaced men in employment and filled the jobs that men had vacated, right? So that's true, that's good. And they're given vast opportunities in the workplace since men were away. Yeah, those things are true as well. What other ways do we see traditional gender roles changing?
They get more salary.
They get more salary? Probably more than they used to. Yeah, so they do, women are able to make more money than they used to. That's definitely true. Yeah, that would be definitely true. What else? What else? What about fashion?
Yeah, there were changes in 1918, so there was a change. So they used to make hair short,
Right?
and they can dance. They can go to club and dance with men.
Yeah, so this is, sorry, Amanda?
Wearing trousers.
Wearing trousers, right? So this is, maybe we'll try and talk about this a little bit after the war ends, but this is a big shift into, from a very sort of traditional and restrictive world for women to one that is much more free and open. And so we'll see this as we move into the 1920s, that haircuts get shorter for women, which is pretty revolutionary. Short skirts where you can actually see a woman's ankles. Ooh, right? Well, at the time the fashion is changing and the idea of what's acceptable is changing as well. And so we'll start to see that as we move into the 20s, that women will not only have more freedom, but they will kind of express it with their fashion. And so hair will get shorter, clothes will become more fashionable, skirts will get a little bit shorter, women will go out sort of dancing and drinking by themselves, which would have been scandalous in 1900, but in 1920 it's much more the norm. What else?
They were allowed to smoke.
Yeah, women would smoke, which was right. But so all of these kind of new personal and social freedoms start to come after the war, and I think you could say that the war kind of gives space for those things to happen, because again, often in times of crisis and emergency, some of the rules get thrown out the window, right? People stop following them, or they just don't make sense anymore. Ananda also says here, women started to have short hair and to wear trousers. Yes, so that's true as well. Trousers, of course, were men's clothing prior to the war, and women always wore skirts or dresses, and yeah, women wearing trousers. Gosh, how risque, and yeah, yikes, woo. But that started happening during this period, right? And so maybe the last question here, and this one is a little more of a personal opinion question, if you will. But what do you think? Let's start with positive. What kind of positive outcomes, or what were some of the positive outcomes of these changes in gender roles, do you think?
Growth in economics.
Growth in economics, probably.
Because due to the employment, the higher employment rate, so there will be more workers, and they can pay less and then get their work done.
Right. So there's some economic changes that come out of this, right? If whether, regardless of what your sort of cultural or social ideas are, your country can only be so productive if only half of your workforce is working, right? And if you can expand your workforce, your country can be more productive and can make more money, right? And so we see that kind of happening here. Women step into the workplace, and as we'll see after the war, women aren't too eager to step back out, right? So now that they're in, at the end of the war, men's expectations is, now our women will go back to the kitchen and be wives and mothers and not work anymore. But of course, women aren't too keen on that now that they've gained some freedom and autonomy and the ability to make their own decisions. Understandably, they want to keep that freedom. But yeah, that's going to be an increase in productivity for these nations that have expanded their workforce as a result, right? What else?
They got more participants in the war.
They what?
They got more participants in the war.
They got more participants in the war, yeah. So women helped the war effort, either directly, so being, say, nurses on the front or working in the military, sending signals or paperwork or things like that, but also at home, right? And I think it would be a very easy argument to make to say that, these countries couldn't have conducted the war effort without women, right? Because again, you can send all of your men to fight, on the front, but the economy of the country still has to keep going, right? People, you need to keep producing food and clothing and all of the things that soldiers need. And so if women hadn't have stepped into the shoes of men and fulfilled those roles, you could not have won the war without women. It's just not possible. Ayushi says some of the positive changes, social stability. Ayushi, I might want a little more from you on that, just to know what you're thinking. It's, go ahead.
So they started getting into parliament. So now you see Angela Merkel and Theresa May.
Okay, so yeah, we see, I guess, the inclusion of women in the political sphere, right? So not only voting, but actually starting to run for office. And so now, of course, the idea that, you can have the head of a major country, either a prime minister or a chancellor or something, having that person be a woman is not a shocking idea to us. But of course, in 1900 or 1915, that would have been quite a stretch for the Brits to imagine that, one day they would have not only one female prime minister, but actually, has it only been two? Margaret Thatcher and Theresa May? I feel like it's only been two, but still, British prime ministers? Anybody? No? Okay. What's that?
They did have a queen before.
And that's true. They did have a queen as well. What's that?
Until now they have the queen.
Right. And since 1952, even though she doesn't really have any real power. Shania here says it opened up different job opportunities for women, like airplane mechanics. Yeah. So women start to be able to do things before that they weren't allowed to do, right? Aishi says here, social status is more stable among citizens. Okay. I think we said that the social and economic order got reshuffled a little bit. Some people were able to increase their household income. So that was probably good, and hopefully that continued for them. What?
Men were able to pay their debt.
Perhaps, yeah. Men were able to pay debts.
Women working.
Right.
Finally got noticed.
Women finally got noticed. Yeah, well, we always noticed you, ladies. Always. But it's true, right? Women, I guess, at least started to gain the recognition that they deserved. And I think I would suggest that they probably didn't quite get the amount of recognition that we would give them today for their efforts. But there was probably at least some recognition of their efforts and their contribution to the war. Again, that's probably less than we do today, but still that's good, right? Okay, what about the negative ones? Negative change.
Women weren't yet equal to men.
What's that?
Women weren't yet equal to men.
Women are still not equal to men, right? So we gain. It's a step toward equality for women, and an important one, and a significant one. But it's not the end of that process, and of course we're still not at the end of that process 105 years later. But just be patient, ladies. We'll get there eventually. Right. So it's a step toward equality, but it's not. It doesn't achieve equality for sure. What else? Shania says here that women were actually exposed to dangerous working conditions in order to get paid. Yeah. Workplace safety was not nearly what it is today, right? And so these women were contributing to the war effort. They were earning money, but at the expense of their health and safety, right? Which arguably everyone in that period would have been doing, but still, that would be a negative outcome for them.
Some women had to act like men to fight the war.
Right. Some women some women took great risks to do what they wanted to do, right? They lied their way into the army in order to serve.
This part of it could be a bit like justified. I mean, today we got the equipment and they basically make everything easier. But back then, let's face it, it's something natural that some physical things that men can do, women aren't able to do, and the opposite also goes around.
Okay.
So maybe they like said, okay, women can't fight because it was way too hard.
Yeah, there's always
Like physically.
I don't think that was the case.
They could justify it like that, but
No, they could justify it like that, but that wasn't the case. They kept them at home to have kids and clean up and do all of that. You didn't give them a chance. So they can't say it's because they
they
want to.
thought
You know?
women were weak, they can handle weight and stuff.
I mean, they just said it without actually knowing it.
it's something that I wanted to let that go a little bit because that's a point that comes up fairly often in terms of gender roles, particularly with regard to occupations, right? The idea that statistically speaking, men usually are bigger and usually are physically stronger than women, on average, statistically speaking, right? And so, you know, there is the argument out there that, of course, men are stronger and therefore they are more suited to do jobs that require strength. And, you know, again, to some degree that is true, but not in all cases, right? And so, yeah, I think I'm just going to leave that one alone. I think for the most part, you know, there might be the odd case in which that is true, but I think for the most part, women can do what men can do. And there are women out there that are much stronger than me, mentally and physically. So I'm just going to leave it there. But it's something that comes up quite often, right? Let's see, where were we? Oh yeah, so Ayushi says women of color didn't have as many rights as white women. Yeah, so that's important too. And the video that we watched was, of course, good, and
Mentioned that.
but he didn't mention that, and that's, I was going to say it's not okay, but it's very common for people to talk about women winning the right to vote for the first time in this period, which they do. However, it's not all women, right? So a certain section of women get to vote, and then another group of women do not and have to wait and continue to fight for decades to gain the right to vote. So again, even though we have a step towards equality for some women don't even get to take that step, right? And it takes longer. So that's a negative outcome for sure, and Ayushi points that out. Michaela says, on the early part of the war, they are looked down by the government, or they are just making ammunition, and they would call names to some women. Yeah, so you could probably say, Michaela, you could probably say that women were indeed making a contribution, but maybe their contribution wasn't as valued as it should have been, right? Because again, you couldn't have won the war without these women. And Ananda says, as their social status was changing, domestic life and expectations about families stayed, which was the main concern of women, remained unanswered. Yeah, so, and this is what Ananda's saying here is a very valid point, and it's even a valid point today, that, you know, traditionally women lived and worked in the domestic sphere, and so their responsibilities were having children and raising children and doing the cooking and the cleaning and looking after the house. But then when they moved out of the house during this period and they start working and having jobs and responsibilities outside the home, those domestic responsibilities don't go away, right? Men don't pick up the slack at home, and so women wind up having all the responsibilities they traditionally had while gaining new ones. And those new ones are good, and it gives them the chance to be more autonomous and more free, but the burden becomes heavier overall. And strangely, well, maybe not so strangely, that is still the case today, where even if you look at, if you imagine, let's say a Canadian couple, okay? Canadian couple living in Canada, husband and a wife, they both work, they both have reasonably equal careers and make equal amounts of money. Who does most of the housework? Still women, right? Who does most of the childcare? Still women, right? So again, even though we've achieved more equality in some places, women are still expected to look after the home and look after the children to a greater degree than men are. And so that's an important point to be made too, is that women gained these extra freedoms, but they weren't able to give up any of their previous responsibilities. And so they just wound up taking on more. And so that was more burden and more pressure. This is pretty good. What do you think? Any other negative outcomes of these changing gender roles?
There's
No
no negative outcome.
negative outcomes?
Because it was already so bad, it can be.
Yeah.
Think of anything bad,
Yeah.
women working.
I think that's pretty good. Okay, tell you what, we've been working really hard. Take a little break, 10 minutes, come back, and we'll
Just men.
talk a little bit more about war stuff, because that's what we're doing. Okay, I'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay. Welcome back, people. Ready, ready, ready? Ready, ready, ready? Okay. So, as you can see, we'll leave women alone for the time being. But again, I'll try and bring back people who are often overlooked in the story of history, because often history becomes the history of old white men. So we'll try to avoid that to some degree if we can. It's true. And so we'll try to avoid that we'll try to mitigate that as we go forward. But certainly women had a very significant impact in the war effort, probably arguably in all Western European countries. And even though a lot of things stayed the same for them in terms of women's expectations and roles, particularly within the sort of domestic sphere or within the home sphere, a lot of things changed for them as well. And we'll see that kind of going through the 1920s and 1930s, where women gained sort of more autonomy, more freedom, more ability to sort of express themselves as individual human beings. They'll gain the right to vote. All of these things will happen. So now I have a little bit for you to read. So I have these pages posted in Microsoft Teams under files, and so you can find that there. And then there's a couple questions at the end, questions 7 and 8. So it's not very much to read. It's just a couple questions that I'd like you to work on. And so I'll give you 15 minutes. Is that okay? I'll give you 15 minutes to read and answer the questions, and then we'll talk about them, okay? So same for you people online. I'll give you a timer here, and you can look at this section of the text, and then you can answer the questions, okay? So I'm just going to start a timer for you, but I'll post this in Microsoft Teams as well so that you have it. I'm going to add you right now, my friend. Okay. Okay. So you might be close to done, hopefully, but we've got about 10 minutes left, so I just wanted to take care of these before the end of class, because they're pretty simple, and there's only a few things I want to highlight from this section for you. So obviously we hear about a number of campaigns or battles. We hear about which armies are involved and how many people are lost, and a lot of that is kind of a level of detail that I don't think we necessarily need to memorize or anything like that, but I do want to talk about a few things. So they point out two, or the question asks about two important battles, Verdun and the Somme. And so what happens at Verdun? That's a small town in France, I believe. And what's the significance of that battle?
So the Germans, I think, they divided a part of the forces instead of going to Paris to go and trap the French armies, which were vulnerable, and I think they were complicated, so they didn't have any defenses.
Right?
So as a result, there was a gap in the line, and they had to retreat to regroup to avoid being enveloped in the circle.
Okay, so there's a gap in the line, and the French have to retreat.
No, the Germans.
The Germans have to retreat. Okay, so they do, and then what happens when they retreat a little bit? It draws in.
Well, the British and the French attack, and then they have to begin, and then they dig in for winter. So they start digging in trenches all over from the English Channel all the way down to the Swiss border.
Right, and that kind of happens at the outset of the war, right? So there's this. That's when Germany tries to invade France, and they sort of get stopped, right? And so all of those trenches get put into place very early in the war. They mentioned something about French reinforcements. What's the German plan here?
I think they were going to distract the French army, so they would deploy some of their men to something.
They would deploy some of their men to something.
So they would find it easier to defeat them in smaller groups.
Right. What else?
Like when the French run for reinforcement, then eventually when they run out of soldiers, Germany will then attack.
Right, and that's maybe I'll rephrase this question just a little bit. What's kind of the feeling that you get out of these two battles? Like, what's the overall plan? Because the what happens at these battles is very indicative of what happens for this entire war. What's the plan for winning?
Divide and conquer.
Divide and conquer, a little bit, yeah. What else, though?
The whole plan was the Schlieffen.
No, it's after Schlieffen. Has to do with, they mention attrition.
Oh, so they dig in and wait to see who breaks first.
Right. So this is, which is interesting and quite tragic at the same time. But, this whole section talks about the idea that winning the war is not about any particular strategic goal. It's not about taking over any particular area. Really what it's about is outlasting the other country, right? So if you're fighting against Germany, the way you're going to win this war is you're going to make sure that they run out of stuff before you do, right? Whether it's food or weapons or artillery shells or human beings that you are sending in wave after wave only to be murdered by machine guns. This is how you're going to win the war, right? By outlasting the other person. And so it's just it really becomes a case of who can throw more resources at the battle, right? Who can throw more munitions, who can throw more soldiers at the battle, and who's ever left standing at the end is the winner, right? And so that's kind of what happens at both Verdun and the Somme, right? Is that it's a case of, can we destroy all of our enemies soldiers and resources. And so the whole war kind of goes on that way, and you can see them in this section of the textbook talking about that in terms of the British and the Canadians and the Americans having the resources to continue, and it looks like Germany eventually will not, right? Germany's eventually going to run out of resources. And so kind of what I want to point out to you in this section is the immense destructive cost of the war, not just in money, but in human lives, right? And the other question I'll ask you is that why are they fighting a war to begin with? Why is Britain, at this point Britain and a little bit France and the Canadians and a little bit later the Americans, why are they fighting the Germans again anyway? Because what? Because they're humans? Okay. Why else are they fighting?
So the French got invaded, so they have to fight. The
Yeah.
British came in after Belgium was invaded, and so they were like, okay, you're neutral, no one's gonna hurt you. But then Germany came in, so they decided to jump in. Canada it's Commonwealth, so it's kind of like it's sworn to assist Britain. The Americans later on received that little telegraph thing.
Yeah, that's the detail version, but like why? But why are they fighting? They're what? They're fighting the war to end the war. What? What?
Fighting the war.
We're fighting so that we don't have to fight it anymore.
I mean, that makes a bit more sense than what the Bolsheviks said.
What did they say?
They said that, okay, we're gonna fight the war by not fighting it.
Right.
Because they promised the Russian people peace.
Right. And so this whole thing is not making a lot of sense, right? Again, it kind of happened by accident. There was, Franz Ferdinand was involved, but people forgot about him a long time ago. Who is he anyway? This whole thing is happening, and they're fighting so that they can not fight, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense. And again, it just becomes a case of who can throw more resources at the war before the other one says, okay, I don't have any more resources. I don't have any more men to throw at this battle. I don't have any more food. I'm out, right? So this is what attrition is. They're just trying to wear each other down. And there's a cost for that, right? There's an economic cost, and there's also a cost in human lives. And you can see that in some of the numbers in the textbook. Those are massive numbers of people to lose in a very short period of time, right? Okay, that is all I'll say today because we are we're not a little bit out of time, we're actually out of time. Come back tomorrow, we'll talk about kind of the ending of the war and the Treaty of Versailles and maybe a couple of other things, okay? But until then, we're all done. Online people, good work today. It was nice to have you here, and I will see you tomorrow.